Clean it up, or get out. Richard Halston snapped, his voice cutting through the glass-walled boardroom like a blade, sharp and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to make people stop breathing. The room obeyed instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. A pen hovered inches above a contract, and somewhere near the end of the polished oak table, a ceramic cup trembled just enough for a thin line of coffee to ripple over its edge and stain the white document beneath it, spreading slowly like something no one wanted to name, while Ava Brooks stood still beside the service cart, one hand lightly gripping the handle, the faint scent of roasted beans and warm milk rising around her as if the moment hadn't fractured, as if time hadn't shifted its weight. She didn't move to wipe the spill, didn't rush to apologize, didn't even look at him right away, and that hesitation, that single beat of stillness, felt louder than any apology could have been, because in a room trained to react instantly to power, she had chosen not to react at all. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle but sharp, the kind that carried judgment without words, while someone near the far end leaned back just enough to whisper, "She's just staff," as if that explained everything, as if that justified the tone, the command, the expectation that she would shrink into the background like the reflection of the city skyline behind them. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his cufflinks catching the overhead light as he adjusted his stance, every detail of him precise, controlled, expensive, a man used to rooms bending before he finished speaking, and now, for the first time in minutes, something wasn't bending, something was holding, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't immediately define. Ava finally lowered her gaze, but not to the spill, not to the floor, her eyes settling instead on the document beneath the spreading stain, the ink slightly blurred at the edges, numbers and clauses bleeding into one another, and for a fraction of a second, something in her expression shifted, not fear, not embarrassment, something quieter, sharper, recognition. The hum of the building's climate system filled the silence, steady and low, as if the entire floor had leaned in to listen, and still, she didn't reach for a cloth, didn't step back, didn't disappear, her fingers loosening slightly on the cart handle as her breathing slowed, measured, deliberate, the kind of calm that didn't belong in moments like this. Richard exhaled through his nose, impatience tightening the corners of his mouth. "Did you hear me?" he said, softer now, which somehow made it heavier, the kind of softness that carried consequences instead of mercy, and a security guard near the door shifted his weight subtly, already anticipating the next command, already ready to move. Because in rooms like this, decisions didn't linger, they happened fast and without hesitation. Ava's eyes traced a single line across the page, then another, her thumb brushing lightly against the edge of the tray as if grounding herself in something real, something steady, while the coffee continued its slow, quiet spread, touching a clause buried halfway down the page, a line no one else had noticed, a line that sat there, unremarkable, waiting, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint drip of liquid meeting paper, soft, almost gentle, completely out of place in a space built on precision and control. She lifted her chin just slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to see clearly. And when her gaze finally met Richard's, it wasn't defiant, it wasn't apologetic, it was something else entirely, something that didn't ask for permission to exist, and that was the exact moment the room, still frozen, felt like it was about to change in a way no one had planned. The silence did not break, it thickened, settling over the boardroom like a weight no one wanted to acknowledge, and Ava could feel it pressing against her skin, the low hum of the ventilation system suddenly louder, sharper, as if every mechanical breath of the building had been amplified. Richard Halston held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture gave him away, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the controlled inhale that did not quite reach his chest, the kind of restraint that came from a man used to immediate obedience and now faced with something unfamiliar, something that did not move when told. "I said clean it," he repeated, slower this time, each word measured, deliberate, as though clarity would restore order, and near the door, the security guard shifted again, one step forward, not yet acting but ready, always ready, because hesitation was not part of the system here. Ava did not look at him immediately, her eyes still anchored to the document, tracing the faint distortion where the coffee had touched the ink, and in that blurred line, something sharpened instead of fading, a detail revealing itself not despite the stain, but because of it, and her breath steadied as her mind moved, fast and precise, the way it always did when something fell off, when numbers did not sit right, when language tried to hide what it meant. Someone at the far end cleared their throat softly, uncomfortable. Another executive tapped a pen once against the table before stopping mid-motion, as if even small sounds had become intrusive, and still no one spoke. No one intervened, because this was not their moment to interrupt. This was a hierarchy in motion, and Ava was not supposed to exist within it beyond the edges. She shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to ground herself. The wheels of the cart clicking softly against the polished floor, a quiet sound that echoed more than it should have. And then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out, not for a cloth, but for the corner of the document, her fingertips brushing the edge with care, as if she were touching something fragile rather than something already marked. Richard's eyes followed the movement instantly, sharp, alert. The irritation now edged with something else, curiosity, or perhaps disbelief. "Do not touch that," he said, not raising his voice. But the command carried weight, the kind that usually ended actions before they began. Yet Ava's hand did not withdraw immediately. It paused, hovering just above the page. And in that pause, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The balance of the room tilting by a fraction. She lifted her eyes once more, meeting his without defiance, without apology. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, almost quiet. The kind of tone that did not fight for attention but held it anyway. "Sir," she said, and the single word seemed to anchor the room even further, drawing every gaze toward her. "Before you sign this, you might want to look at Section 12, Paragraph C." And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a sentence placed carefully into the silence like a piece set on a board. And for a moment, nothing happened. No immediate reaction, no dismissal. Just a stillness so complete it felt suspended, until one of the attorneys near the middle of the table shifted, almost involuntarily, his hand moving toward the document, eyes narrowing slightly as if pulled by instinct rather than instruction, while Richard remained perfectly still, his gaze flicking from Ava to the page and back again, calculating, weighing, and for the first time since he had entered the room. He did not speak right away. The attorney did not speak at first, his fingers hovering just above the page as if the paper itself might resist him. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he pulled the document closer, the faint scrape of paper against polished wood echoing louder than it should have, his eyes scanning down the lines Ava had pointed to, past the headings, past the familiar language, until they reached Section 12, Paragraph C, and there, his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention, but in the smallest tightening around his eyes, the kind of shift only someone trained to read risk would recognize. Across the table, another executive leaned in, sensing something without yet understanding it, while a third adjusted his glasses, trying to follow along. The room no longer frozen, but quietly rearranging itself around a detail no one had noticed before. Richard remained still at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the attorney, waiting, measuring, his silence no longer absolute authority but something closer to calculation, as if he were allowing the moment to unfold instead of controlling it. The attorney cleared his throat softly, then stopped, his voice catching before it could form, and instead of speaking, he flipped back one page, then forward again, confirming, double-checking, his pen tapping once against the margin before going still. Ava did not move, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, the cart beside her forgotten, her breathing steady, her focus no longer on the document, but on the shift happening in the room, subtle, precise, irreversible. "Where did you say?" the attorney asked finally, not looking at her, his voice directed toward the table, but carrying enough to reach everyone, and Ava answered without hesitation. "Section 12, Paragraph C." Her tone unchanged, calm, certain, and this time, several heads turned at once. The words landing differently now, no longer dismissed, no longer background. The attorney exhaled slowly, then leaned back just enough to look toward Richard, a pause stretching between them, filled not with uncertainty, but with recognition. And when he spoke again, it was quieter than expected. "This clause shifts all post-agreement liability to us," he said, each word deliberate, careful, as though the room itself required precision. "If anything goes wrong after signing, regulatory issues, financial discrepancies, legal exposure, it all falls here." His pen tapped lightly against the page. "They walk away clean." The words settled into the space, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment, no one reacted, not outwardly. But the air changed, the kind of change that could not be undone once recognized. Richard's eyes dropped to the document in front of him, his fingers resting on the edge of the page. The same page he had been seconds away from signing. And as he scanned the lines now, slower, sharper, something in his expression shifted, the confidence that had filled the room earlier tightening into focus, into something narrower, more exact, his jaw setting slightly as the implication settled in. A faint murmur moved through the executives, low, controlled, the kind of sound that came from professionals realizing a mistake before it happened, and one of them reached for his tablet, pulling up a digital copy, scrolling quickly, verifying, while another leaned closer to the attorney, whispering something that was not quite audible, but carried urgency. Ava stood where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence no longer invisible, but not yet acknowledged, suspended in the space between what she had been and what the room was beginning to see. And in that silence, in that narrow gap between realization and response, Richard Halston did something he had not done since the meeting began. He stopped reaching for the pen. No one reached for the pen again, not even out of habit. And that absence of motion carried more weight than any spoken correction. The kind of shift that did not need to be announced because everyone in the room could feel it settling into place. Richard Halston leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating but recalibrating. His fingers still resting against the edge of the document as his eyes moved across the page with a precision that had built empires. A second reading that no longer trusted assumptions, and the faint reflection of the city skyline in the glass behind him seemed sharper now, colder, as if the light itself had changed. "Run that again," he said quietly, not looking up, his voice no longer cutting but controlled in a different way, a tone reserved for moments when mistakes were too expensive to ignore, and the attorney nodded immediately, flipping through the pages with more urgency now, cross-referencing clauses, scanning footnotes, the soft rustle of paper replacing the earlier silence, while another executive began typing quickly on a tablet, pulling up related documents, numbers, projections, all of it moving faster than before, but with a different kind of focus, a precision driven by risk instead of routine. Ava remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, but the room no longer treated her as part of the background. Glances flickered toward her and away again, brief, uncertain, as if acknowledging her directly would require admitting something they were not ready to say out loud. And near the door, the security guard who had stepped forward earlier now shifted back, almost imperceptibly, his stance easing, the command he had anticipated dissolving without ever being given. Richard finally lifted his gaze, not toward the table, not toward the attorney, but toward Ava, and this time he did not speak immediately, his eyes studying her in a way that measured more than presence, more than role, as if recalculating where she belonged in a room that had already decided that for her. "How did you catch that?" he asked after a moment. The question simple but heavy, not an accusation, not yet an acknowledgement, something in between, and Ava did not rush to answer, her breath steady, her voice when it came just as calm as before. "It does not read like a protection clause," she said, her words careful but clear. "It reads like a transfer." And she paused, not to dramatize but to be precise. "The wording is soft, but the structure is not." And a faint shift moved through the executives again, a recognition not just of the problem, but of the clarity with which she had seen it. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration but in focus, his mind moving through implications, scenarios, consequences, and for a brief second, the version of him that had entered the room, certain, commanding, untouched by doubt, flickered, replaced by something sharper, something more aware, and he looked back down at the page, then to the attorney, who gave a small, confirming nod, the kind that did not leave room for interpretation. No one spoke after that. Not right away, because the room no longer needed more words. The truth had already settled, quiet and irreversible, and in that silence, Ava Brooks stood no longer as someone passing through the edges of power, but as the reason it had just stopped. The room did not return to normal. It adjusted, slowly, carefully, like something fragile that had been dropped but not yet broken, and every person at the table seemed to understand that the next words would matter more than the last ones spoken, because the dynamic had shifted and no one could pretend it had not. Richard Halston closed the folder halfway, not shutting it, just enough to pause the momentum of the meeting, his thumb resting against the edge as if holding the entire decision in place. And for a brief moment he looked past Ava, toward the glass wall where the city stretched out in clean lines and distant movement, a world that ran on precision and timing, the same world that had almost absorbed a mistake hidden in plain sight. "Get legal on a full review," he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, but different now, directed not at Ava but at the room, and the attorney nodded immediately, already gathering documents, already moving with a renewed urgency that no longer questioned the need for caution. Another executive began drafting a message, fingers moving quickly across the screen, while a third leaned back, exhaling slowly as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding. The rhythm of the room had changed from command to recalibration, from assumption to verification, and at the center of that shift stood someone who had not been meant to stand there at all. Ava remained still, her presence now undeniable, yet she did not step forward to claim it, did not fill the space with more words, because the moment did not need more explanation, it needed time to settle, and she understood that instinctively, the same way she had understood the clause without needing anyone to point it out. Richard turned back toward her, this time fully, his attention no longer divided, and for a second, the room seemed to narrow around that line of sight, the distance between them carrying more meaning than the entire table behind him. "What is your name?" he asked, the question simple, but the tone different, stripped of the earlier edge, and Ava answered without hesitation, "Ava Brooks." Her voice even, grounded, the same tone she had used from the beginning, because nothing about her had changed, only the way the room was now listening. He repeated it once, quietly, as if committing it to memory. "Ava," and then nodded slightly, not a gesture of approval, not quite acknowledgement, but something close, something that did not belong to the version of him who had started the meeting. A faint shift passed through the executives again, this time not confusion, but recognition. The unspoken understanding that the hierarchy they had relied on a moment ago had just been interrupted by something they could not easily categorize, and no one moved to dismiss her, no one gestured toward the door, the space she occupied no longer temporary but held, if only for now. Richard glanced once more at the document, then at the attorney, who gave another confirming nod, and the finality of that exchange settled the matter without needing further discussion. The signature that had been seconds away now indefinitely delayed. Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not in submission but in quiet release. The tension she had carried easing just enough to breathe, the scent of coffee still lingering faintly in the air, a reminder of how small the moment had started and how large it had become, and in the stillness that followed, no one asked her to clean the spill. The meeting did not resume. It transformed, the structure still intact, but the energy beneath it altered in a way no one could ignore, and for the first time since the doors had closed, there was a hesitation in how people moved, a subtle recalibration of who spoke, who waited, and who was being watched. The attorney gathered the documents into a tighter stack, his fingers pressing the edges together with care, as if the pages themselves now required more respect than before, while across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, lowering his voice as he spoke quietly to the colleague beside him, their words too soft to carry, but their expressions unmistakable, the kind of restrained concern that followed a narrowly avoided mistake. Ava remained beside the cart, but the cart no longer defined her place in the room. It sat slightly behind her now, almost incidental, as if it belonged to a version of the moment that had already passed, and she did not reach for it, did not retreat into it, because something in the room had shifted enough to allow her to stand without shrinking. Richard Halston adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, habitual movement, but the rhythm of it had changed, less automatic, more deliberate. His attention no longer sweeping the room in broad control, but narrowing, focusing, recalculating each detail as it presented itself. "Delay the signing," he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a finality that redirected the entire course of the meeting, and immediately, the assistant near the wall straightened, already making note, already preparing to inform the other side. The quiet efficiency of the system still intact, but now guided by caution rather than certainty. A faint nod passed between two executives, a silent agreement that what had just happened would not be dismissed, that it would be documented, revisited, analyzed. And in that acknowledgement, Ava's presence moved from anomaly to factor, something that had influenced outcome rather than merely interrupted it. She inhaled slowly, the air in the room cooler now against her skin, the lingering scent of coffee fading beneath the sharper note of polished wood and paper. And for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had just occurred, not as triumph, not as relief, but as something quieter, the simple recognition that she had not stayed silent when it would have been easier to do so. Richard's gaze returned to her again, less guarded this time, not searching for fault but for understanding. And when he spoke, his tone carried a different kind of control, one that did not rely on volume or command. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, the question direct, but without accusation, and the room stilled again, not with tension, but with attention. Ava paused, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the way words would now be received differently. And when she responded, her voice remained steady, grounded in truth rather than performance. "I used to help my grandfather review documents," she said, her eyes steady. "He believed that what is written matters more than what is said." And a faint shift passed through the room, not dramatic, not loud, but present, the kind of shift that came when something simple revealed something deeper. Richard held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the fact that he had asked, and in that quiet exchange, the distance between authority and presence narrowed, not erased, but changed, and no one in the room missed it. The room settled into a quieter rhythm, not relaxed but attentive, as if every movement now carried intention, and Ava could feel the difference in the way space held her, no longer something to move around, but something to account for, a subtle shift that did not need acknowledgement to be real. One of the executives across the table leaned back slowly, folding his hands together as he studied her with a new kind of focus. Not curiosity alone, but evaluation, the kind usually reserved for people seated at the table rather than standing beside it. While another adjusted the angle of his tablet, no longer scrolling past her presence but pausing, watching, recalibrating. Richard Halston remained at the head of the table, but his posture had changed, not in dominance but in awareness, his attention no longer sweeping the room in broad strokes, but landing deliberately. And when he glanced down at the document again, it was not with the assumption of control, but with the recognition that control had nearly failed him. "Pull the original draft from their side," he said, his voice steady, directed toward the legal team, and immediately one of the associates began typing, fingers moving quickly, retrieving files, comparing versions, the soft clicking of keys filling the silence in a way that felt purposeful rather than routine. Ava stood still, her shoulders relaxed but her focus intact, aware that the moment had not ended, only shifted into something more complex, something that required patience rather than reaction. And she let the silence do its work, understanding instinctively that speaking again too soon would fracture the balance that had just been formed. A few seconds passed. Then the associate looked up, hesitating for the briefest moment before turning the tablet toward the attorney. "There is a revision from 48 hours ago," he said carefully. The language in Section 12 was altered, and the attorney leaned in, eyes narrowing as he compared the two versions side by side. The difference subtle but unmistakable, a single line adjusted, a phrase softened, just enough to redirect responsibility without drawing attention. A quiet murmur moved through the table, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to signal collective recognition, and Richard's gaze sharpened again, not Outward this time, but inward, focused on the implications, the timing, the intent behind the change. Ava watched the exchange without interruption, her breathing even, her presence steady, as if she had stepped into a current she understood but did not need to control, and for a moment, the room seemed to revolve around the document rather than the people, the paper now carrying more weight than any title or position. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table before. Stilling, a controlled release rather than impatience, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something new, not just authority but acknowledgement of risk. "We were meant to miss that," he said, not to anyone in particular, but the words landed across the room, settling into the space between them. No one contradicted him, no one rushed to respond, because the truth of it did not require debate, it required acceptance. And in that acceptance, the earlier tension dissolved into something sharper, something more precise. Ava's eyes lowered briefly to the document once more, then lifted again, her expression unchanged, because for her, the moment was not about being right. It was about not letting something wrong pass unnoticed, and that distinction held steady even as the room around her continued to shift. Richard looked at her again, not as an interruption, not as an anomaly, but as part of the equation now. And in that quiet recognition, something unspoken moved between them. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of it. The realization did not fade. It deepened, settling into the room with a quiet authority that no one challenged. And as the revised document glowed on the tablet screen, the difference between the two versions no longer looked like a minor adjustment, but like intention, precise and calculated, something that had been designed to pass unnoticed in a room that usually moved too fast to question. The associate scrolled slowly, highlighting the altered phrasing, and the attorney leaned closer, his brow tightening as he followed each line, comparing structure, tone, implication, the kind of detailed reading that should have happened hours earlier, but had been replaced by trust, by routine, by assumption. Richard Halston watched without interrupting, his expression controlled but sharpened, his attention fixed not only on the words but on the timing, the last-minute revision, the subtlety of the change, and for a moment, the silence in the room carried something heavier than tension. It carried awareness, the kind that comes when a mistake is not just avoided but understood. Ava remained still, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer peripheral, and yet she did not step into the conversation, did not claim space that had not been offered, because she understood something the room was just beginning to learn. That clarity did not need volume to be felt. One of the senior partners shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly as he leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him. "That would have gone through," he murmured, not to anyone specific, but the words carried, and no one disagreed, because they all knew it was true. The meeting had been moving forward, the signature had been seconds away, and the clause had been sitting there, quiet and patient, waiting to do exactly what it was written to do. Richard's hand rested flat against the table now, no longer near the pen, no longer moving toward action, but holding the moment in place. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "We verify everything from this point forward," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a reset, a recalibration of the room itself. And the executives nodded almost in unison, the hierarchy still intact, but now operating under a different awareness. The attorney began outlining next steps, his tone measured, precise, outlining a full audit of the agreement, cross-checking every clause, every revision, every timestamp, while the associate documented changes, capturing details that would have been overlooked before. And through it all, Ava stood quietly, not removed but not centered either, occupying a space that did not have a name in the room's structure, yet could not be ignored. Richard's gaze shifted to her again, this time not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging something that had already been proven. And there was a brief pause, the kind that carried weight without sound. Before he spoke, "You saw it because you read it differently," he said, more statement than question, and Ava met his gaze with the same calm steadiness. "I read what it does, not just what it says," she replied, her voice even, grounded, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any technical explanation could have. A faint silence followed, not empty but full. the kind that holds recognition rather than uncertainty, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to align around a single truth, that what had nearly been signed was not just a document, but a test, and the person who had seen it clearly had not been the one expected to see it at all. The room did not rush forward. It lingered in the space Ava's words had created, a space where assumptions no longer felt safe, and every detail demanded attention. And for a moment, no one moved except for the quiet shifting of screens and papers, the soft glow of tablets reflecting across polished surfaces as the legal team continued to trace the document line by line. Richard Halston remained still at the head of the table, his posture no longer projecting urgency, but control of a different kind, the kind that comes after recognizing how close control had come to slipping, and his gaze moved once more between the document and Ava, not searching for error but measuring something deeper, something harder to define. One of the executives cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward. "If this revision came in 48 hours ago, who approved it on our side?" he asked, his voice careful, precise. And the question hung in the air longer than expected, because it was not just procedural, it was personal. It implied oversight, and oversight in a room like this was never neutral. The associate hesitated, scanning the metadata, fingers moving quickly, then slower, then stopping altogether as his expression tightened. "It was routed through automated approval after initial clearance," he said, choosing each word carefully. No manual review was triggered after the revision, and a subtle tension returned to the room, not chaotic, not loud, but focused, the kind that sharpened rather than scattered. Ava listened without interrupting, her presence steady, aware that the conversation had moved beyond the clause itself into the system that had allowed it to pass. And she did not step into that space, because her role had never been to take over the room, only to stop it from moving in the wrong direction. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, a single controlled motion that drew attention without demanding it. And when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet finality. "Then the system failed," he said, not assigning blame to a person, but to a process. And that distinction shifted the tone of the room again, redirecting focus from defense to correction. The executives nodded, some more slowly than others, the implications settling in layers, because systems did not fail without consequence. And every person in the room understood that the cost of that failure had almost been signed into existence. Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not in retreat but in reflection, the memory of her grandfather's voice echoing softly in her mind, reminding her that what matters is not how something looks, but what it does. And she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in that thought as the room continued to adjust around her. Richard looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation in his gaze, no uncertainty in how he regarded her, only a quiet acknowledgement that had not existed before. And for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not erased, but redefined. "You saw what all of us missed," he said, his voice even, not loud, but carrying across the table with clarity, and no one interrupted. No one dismissed the statement, because it was no longer a matter of perception, it was fact. Ava met his gaze, her expression unchanged, not seeking validation, not resisting it, simply holding the truth of the moment as it was. And in that silence that followed, something settled into place, not just in the room, but in the way she was now seen, no longer invisible, no longer secondary, but undeniable. No one spoke immediately after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the truth had already been said, and anything more would only dilute it. And the room seemed to understand that instinctively, holding on to the silence as if it were the only honest response left. Richard Halston leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer scanning the room, but resting on a fixed point somewhere beyond the table, beyond the glass walls, as if replaying the moment in his mind, the raised voice, the assumption, the command that had come so easily to him just minutes ago, and now, in contrast, the stillness of it all felt heavier than any mistake he had avoided. His hand moved slowly across the table, not toward the pen this time, but toward the closed edge of the document, pressing it flat as if to ground the situation. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, not authority, not correction, but reflection. "We almost signed that," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, and the quiet weight of the sentence settled across the room like a final acknowledgement. The attorney gave a small nod, confirming what no one needed confirmed anymore, while the executives remained still, their earlier confidence replaced by a more careful awareness, the kind that came after seeing how easily something critical could be missed. Ava stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and yet everything about how the room perceived her had shifted, not because she had demanded attention, but because she had earned it without asking. Richard turned his gaze back to her, slower this time, deliberate, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow again around that line of sight, the distance between them carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. "You could have stayed quiet," he said, his tone even, not accusing, not praising, just stating a fact. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, grounded in something deeper than the room itself. "Yes, sir," she replied, and there was no need for more explanation in that word, because the choice had already been made and proven. A faint shift passed through the executives again, not tension this time, but recognition, the kind that came when someone did something that could not be reduced to role or title, and for a moment, no one looked at her as staff, no one looked at her as temporary. They looked at her as the reason the meeting had changed direction. Richard exhaled slowly, the controlled release of someone recalibrating not just a decision, but a perspective, and his hand moved once more, this time away from the document entirely, signaling something final without words, and the assistant near the wall straightened again, preparing to formalize the delay, to notify the other side, to adjust the entire schedule around a moment that had not been planned. Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not in retreat, but in quiet understanding, the weight of the moment settling into something steadier, something less sharp, but no less real, and the faint scent of coffee still lingered in the air, a reminder of how small the moment had begun. Richard looked at her one last time, and though he did not say it, something in his expression had changed, something that did not belong to authority or control, something closer to recognition, and in the silence that followed, no one asked her to step back, no one asked her to leave, because for the first time since she had entered the room, she was exactly where she needed to be. The meeting did not end with a clear signal. No one stood abruptly, no chair scraped back. Instead it dissolved slowly, like tension releasing in layers, and the executives began to gather their devices and notes with a quieter kind of focus, their movements more deliberate than before, as if each action now carried awareness of what had nearly happened. The attorney closed his folder carefully this time, aligning the edges with precision, while the associate double-checked timestamps and revisions one last time, unwilling to leave anything unverified. And across the table, a senior partner exhaled deeply before standing, his expression thoughtful, subdued, the kind of look that follows a moment that shifts more than just a decision. Ava remained still for a second longer, allowing the room to move around her, the sound of footsteps soft against the polished floor, the low murmur of voices returning but never rising above a certain level, as if the room itself had agreed to remain quieter than before. Richard Halston stood last, not out of hesitation but intention, his chair sliding back with controlled ease, and for a moment, he did not move toward the door or toward anyone else, his attention fixed on the table where the document still rested, the faint coffee stain marking the place where everything had changed. He reached out and closed the folder fully this time, pressing it flat with his palm, not as a gesture of completion, but of containment, as if acknowledging that what had almost been set into motion would now remain still. The others began to exit, one by one, offering brief nods, quiet acknowledgments, but none of them addressed Ava directly, not out of dismissal, but out of uncertainty, as if they had not yet learned how to place her within the structure they understood. When the last of them stepped out, the room grew still again, larger now without the presence of many voices, and the hum of the building returned to the foreground, steady and constant. Ava finally shifted, her hand returning lightly to the handle of the service card, not because she needed to, but because it was something familiar, something grounding, and she began to turn it slightly, preparing to leave, to return to the role that had defined her before this moment. "Ava," Richard's voice stopped her, not sharp, not commanding, just clear enough to hold her in place. and she turned back, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged. He walked around the table slowly, not rushing, each step measured, closing the distance that had once felt so fixed, and when he stopped a few feet away from her, the space between them felt different now, not defined by hierarchy alone, but by something that had shifted beneath it. For a brief moment, he said nothing, as if choosing his words with the same care he had just applied to the contract. And when he finally spoke, his tone carried a quiet sincerity that had not been present before. "You did not just catch a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "You stopped a very expensive one." And the words settled between them, not as praise, not as compensation, but as acknowledgement, something earned rather than given. Ava held his gaze, her expression calm, not seeking recognition, not resisting it, simply accepting the truth of the moment as it was. And in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them, not a resolution, not yet, but the beginning of one, grounded not in power, but in clarity. Richard did not step back immediately after speaking, and that stillness carried more meaning than any formal gesture could have, the kind of pause that allowed something genuine to exist without being rushed or framed, and Ava could feel it, the shift in the air between them no longer defined by instruction or expectation, but by recognition that had not been there before. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, grounded, then gave a small nod, not as agreement, not as submission, but as acknowledgement of what had been said, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle something in the room that had not yet found its place. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing in a way that was almost imperceptible, and for a brief second, the man who had entered the room earlier, certain and unchallenged, felt distant, replaced by someone more aware of the space around him, more aware of the people within it. "You should not be standing behind a cart," he said after a moment, his tone quieter now, not commanding, not dismissive, but reflective, as if he were stating something he had only just realized. And the words did not carry assumption. They carried reconsideration. Ava's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened slightly, not because she was surprised, but because she understood what he was actually saying beneath the surface. And when she responded, her voice remained calm, measured. "Sometimes where you stand is not where you belong," she said. The words simple, but they settled into the room with a weight that did not need explanation. Richard gave a slight nod, absorbing that, not responding immediately, because for the first time, he was not looking to lead the conversation, he was listening, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked something larger than the moment itself. The hum of the building filled the space again, steady and neutral, the world outside continuing without pause, while inside, something quieter had taken root, something that did not need urgency to matter. Ava's hand rested lightly on the handle of the cart again, her fingers relaxed, her posture steady, and she turned it slightly, not in retreat, but in readiness to move forward, whatever that meant next, and she did not ask for permission, did not wait for instruction, because she no longer needed either to define her place in that moment. Richard watched her for a second longer, then stepped back just enough to clear the path, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect, a small movement that said more than a formal acknowledgement ever could. And as she began to move toward the door, the wheels of the cart rolling softly against the floor, the sound felt different now, not background noise, but something present, something noticed. Just before she reached the door, she paused, not turning fully, just enough to glance back, and their eyes met one last time, not as employer and employee, not as power and position, but as two people who had shared a moment that shifted something fundamental, and neither of them needed to say anything more. As she stepped out into the hallway, the light from outside the room felt warmer, softer against her skin, and behind her, the boardroom remained. Still, the document untouched, the decision delayed, and in that quiet space, Richard Halston stood for a moment longer, looking at the table where everything had almost gone wrong, then at the door where everything had just changed, and for the first time that day, he did not reach for control. He let the moment stand exactly as it was. Richard did not step back immediately after speaking, and that stillness carried more meaning than any formal gesture could have, the kind of pause that allowed something genuine to exist without being rushed or framed. and Ava could feel it. The shift in the air between them no longer defined by instruction or expectation, but by recognition that had not been there before. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, grounded, then gave a small nod, not as agreement, not as submission, but as acknowledgement of what had been said, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle something in the room that had not yet found its place. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing in a way that was almost imperceptible, and for a brief second, the man who had entered the room earlier, certain and unchallenged, felt distant, replaced by someone more aware of the space around him, more aware of the people within it. "You should not be standing behind a cart," he said after a moment, his tone quieter now, not commanding, not dismissive, but reflective, as if he were stating something he had only just realized. And the words did not carry assumption. They carried reconsideration. Ava's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened slightly, not because she was surprised, but because she understood what he was actually saying beneath the surface, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, measured. "Sometimes where you stand is not where you belong," she said, the words simple, but they settled into the room with a weight that did not need explanation. Richard gave a slight nod, absorbing that, not responding immediately, because for the first time, he was not looking to lead the conversation, he was listening, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked something larger than the moment itself. The hum of the building filled the space again, steady and neutral, the world outside continuing without pause, while inside, something quieter had taken root, something that did not need urgency to matter. Ava's hand rested lightly on the handle of the cart again, her fingers relaxed, her posture steady, and she turned it slightly, not in retreat, but in readiness to move forward, whatever that meant next, and she did not ask for permission, did not wait for instruction, because she no longer needed either to define her place in that moment. Richard watched her for a second longer, then stepped back just enough to clear the path, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect, a small movement that said more than a formal acknowledgement ever could. And as she began to move toward the door, the wheels of the cart rolling softly against the floor, the sound felt different now, not background noise, but something present, something noticed. Just before she reached the door, she paused, not turning fully, just enough to glance back, and their eyes met one last time, not as employer and employee, not as power and position, but as two people who had shared a moment that shifted something fundamental, and neither of them needed to say anything more. As she stepped out into the hallway, the light from outside the room felt warmer, softer against her skin, and behind her, the boardroom remained still, the document untouched, the decision delayed, and in that quiet space, Richard Halston stood for a moment longer, looking at the table where everything had almost gone wrong, then at the door where everything had just changed, and for the first time that day, he did not reach for control. He let the moment stand exactly as it was.